Picture this. You just finished a relentlessly long, incredibly stressful day at work. You finally sit down on the couch, listen to the clink of ice in a glass, or maybe you watch the condensation drip down the side of an ice-cold beer. It feels like the most normal, relatable way to just unwind after grinding away all day, right? But what if I told you that simple, everyday action actually traces back millions of years? Welcome to This Explainer, because the true story of why you crave that drink is about to completely flip how you see human history.
So, why do we drink? Honestly, it's a question we usually just shrug off. We point to culture or slick advertising or just everyday habits. We tend to view alcohol as a modern vice, or a purely social construct that we invented somewhere along the way. But the science shows something totally different. Our attraction to alcohol is actually a deeply wired evolutionary mystery.
The wild reality is this. It's literally an evolutionary survival tool. Our ancient primate ancestors didn't just accidentally tolerate alcohol. They actively evolved to look for it. And honestly, if they hadn't, you and I probably wouldn't even be sitting here today. Let's clear up a massive myth right out of the gate. The modern myth is that drinking is a relatively recent mistake, like something humans stumbled into only after we invented farming, settled down, and basically had leftover grain fermenting in our clay pots. But the ancient reality? We actually have 10 million years of genetic adaptation to ethanol. We were actively processing alcohol long before we were even human. This brings us to a brilliant concept called the drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. So, around 10 million years ago, the Earth was cooling down, and African forests were rapidly thinning out. Our primate ancestors were facing some intense desperation. They were basically forced out of the safety of the leafy canopy and down onto the unforgiving ground, just to avoid starving. Now, down on the forest floor, fruit doesn't hang perfectly ripe on branches. It falls, it sits in the intense heat, and wild yeast colonizes it, which ferments the natural sugars right into ethanol. Dudley argues that our ancestors relied heavily on this rotting, alcoholic fruit as a primary life-saving calorie source, just to survive this brutal environmental shift.
Now check out this number, 40X. When our ancestors transitioned to the ground, they developed a very specific genetic mutation called ADH4. This single, extraordinary mutation made their livers 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol. Think about that. The primates who had this mutation could eat essentially spoiled, highly fermented fruit and extract critical, life-saving energy from it without dying from severe poisoning. And the ones who couldn't handle the ethanol, well, they got sick, they couldn't compete for calories, and they literally starved to death. Their lineage just faded away. Let's jump forward a bit and see how this builds into an incredible paradigm shift for early humans. Back in 2018, archaeologists excavating the Raqefet Cave in Israel made a stunning discovery that dates back 13,000 years. This site belonged to the Natufian people. And carved directly into the solid bedrock of the cave, researchers found stone mortars containing something completely unexpected, a prehistoric brewery. Stanford University's Li Lu noted that this discovery accounts for the oldest record of man-made alcohol in the world. Just let that sink in. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. Yet they were deliberately malting, mashing, and fermenting wild wheat and barley to produce this thick, sour, porridge-like beer. Okay, so yeah, it wasn't exactly a crisp modern IPA, but to them, it was absolutely revolutionary. They were brewing millennia before they ever domesticated grain. It strongly suggests we didn't settle down and invent farming just to bake bread. We very likely did it for the beer.
All right, let's get into the specifics. Number 1, the caloric signal following the scent.
So let's break down the actual day-to-day mechanics of how this shaped human history. Imagine navigating a dense, incredibly competitive tropical rainforest millions of years ago. Finding food is literally a daily matter of life or death. Ethanol is a uniquely light molecule, which means it gets carried rapidly and efficiently by the wind through thick vegetation. The scent of alcohol literally acted as a long-distance beacon, guiding our starving primate ancestors directly to sugar-rich, life-saving food. As Robert Dudley explains, ethanol provided a crucial olfactory cue to find calorically rich fruits up close. But it did way more than just lead them to the food. Once they started eating, those low concentrations of alcohol actually stimulated their appetites. It's a biological phenomenon known as the aperitif effect. By making our ancestors feel even hungrier, the alcohol ensured they consumed far more of those essential nutrients and calories from the fruit, which effectively kept them alive in a desperately unforgiving environment.
Moving on to number 2. The trust molecule, building Göbekli Tepe. So that covers individual survival. But how did alcohol actually build complex society? Well, according to the extensive research of cognitive scientist Edward Slingerland, alcohol served as a crucial social technology. As human groups inevitably grew larger and early trade networks expanded, the stakes of meeting strangers were incredibly high. Confrontations over guarding resources often ended in intense violence. We desperately needed a way for absolute strangers to collaborate on massive projects without killing each other. So, the crucial point here is that vulnerability equals trust. Human beings are deeply tribal by nature. We have intense, evolutionarily programmed cognitive defenses up around people we don't know. But communal drinking chemically lowered those strict cognitive defenses and temporarily bypassed our rigid tribal instincts. By becoming chemically vulnerable together through mild intoxication, suspicious strangers could finally shake hands, form lasting alliances, and engage in anonymous collaboration. You simply couldn't build a city, a temple, or an empire without it.
The most profound evidence for this is beautifully preserved at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which is widely considered the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. Archaeologists excavated the site and discovered massive 160-liter limestone vessels. To put that into perspective for you, those are essentially the ancient equivalents of massive modern beer kegs, just carved entirely out of solid stone. And inside, they found traces of calcium oxalate, which is a definitive, undeniable chemical byproduct of brewing beer. This massive site wasn't even a permanent settlement. Scattered bands of hunter-gatherers traveled from far away just to gather there. It heavily implies that the earliest, most grueling monumental construction by humans was centrally organized around massive communal feasting and enormous beer consumption.
Which brings us to number 3, the psychological buffer, surviving the Paleolithic. We have to remember that the Paleolithic era was relentlessly, mercilessly harsh. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Starvation was basically a seasonal guarantee, and massive predators were a constant, daily threat. Ancient humans carried immense psychological trauma, and they needed a way to process the sheer existential dread of everyday survival. This is exactly where the endorphin system comes into play. The psychopharmacological effects of alcohol, like euphoria, anxiety relief, emotional disinhibition, served as a necessary, collective coping mechanism. Gathering around a warm fire to share a fermented drink directly triggered the brain's endorphin system. It wasn't just about throwing a party. It was vital emotional processing that heavily reinforced social bonds and allowed our ancestors to endure a terrifying world. That rush of relief and connection you feel at a modern Friday happy hour? That is the exact same chemical mechanism that kept your ancient ancestors from succumbing to the overwhelming terror of the Paleolithic darkness.
All right, number 4, chronological rapid-fire recap.
Let's do a rapid-fire chronological recap of how all these puzzle pieces fit together based exactly on the verified archaeological and genetic record. Because when you see the timeline lined up, the sheer scale of this relationship is just staggering. Starting 10 million years ago, the ADH4 mutation allows our ape ancestors to efficiently metabolize ethanol to survive in shrinking, desperate forests. By 13,000 years ago, Natufian hunter-gatherers are already intentionally brewing wild grain beer in the bedrock of Rekefet Cave in Israel. Fast forward to 9,000 years ago, and the Neolithic village of Yehu in China is producing a highly sophisticated mixed fermented drink made of rice, honey, and fruit. And by 3400 BCE at Hierakonpolis in Egypt, they have officially established massive industrial-scale breweries to literally pay the thousands of workers building their civilization. And finally, number 5, the evolutionary hangover, the modern mismatch.
Here is where the story shifts dramatically. We really have to talk about how this all translates today. All of those incredible ancient benefits we just discussed were completely reliant on a very specific set of natural constraints. And in our modern world, we've basically broken every single one of them. Look at this direct comparison. In our ancestral environment, ethanol was always incredibly dilute. It naturally maxed out at just a few percent, and it was always heavily bundled with fiber, water, crucial nutrients, and deep community rituals. But today's modern environment is entirely different. We have distilled, highly concentrated spirits available at every brightly lit supermarket and corner bar, completely stripped of all those ancient natural limits. The deep evolutionary logic that once kept us alive is now completely mismatched with a modern world that delivers ethanol in sheer concentrations no African forest could ever possibly produce.
So we've finally come back to our starting question. Does the trade-off still hold? You come home after a long day, you open a cold bottle, and you take a sip. You aren't doing it because of some recent cultural invention or a catchy billboard. You're doing it because of a deep biological survival impulse forged 10 million years ago on the sweltering floor of a dying jungle.
The mechanism hasn't changed, the dosage has. So, the next time you pour yourself a glass to unwind, ask yourself, who is really craving that drink? You or the 10 million years of human history hiding in your DNA?